In 1292 BCE, around October, a small ship plied the waters of the Nile. Powered by rowers hauling on their oars, the boat made swift passage downriver, following the current. It had left the city of Waset, modern Luxor, a few days earlier, traveling in haste. Aboard, a royal messenger carried news. It was unfortunate news. The ship hurried to the town of Abdju, modern Abydos. There, Egypt's pharaoh, Wasmuria Ramesses, or Ramesses II, was holding court. The king had come to Abdju just a week or two earlier to visit the ancient cemeteries and temples of this region. He had also come to commune with his father, the Osiris Seti I. Now, Ramesses would have to consult the gods again on a most particular matter. The ship discharged its passenger, who hurried to bring his message to the king. The word was bad, a death at the great temple of Karnak. The top-ranking priest of that temple, a man named Netjer, had passed to the west. This left a vacancy in the priesthood of Amun-Ra, king of the gods and lord of the southern city. Now, Ramesses would have to choose a successor. In regnal year 1, the third month of Akhet, the flood season, Ramesses II appointed a new high priest for the god Amun. This was an important job, responsible not just for offerings and the well-being of Amun's image at Karnak, but also for the people, the land, and the vast economic assets attached to Amun's sanctuary. The first priest of Amun, or Netjer Tepy, was one of the most powerful individuals in the southern city. Whoever Ramesses chose was going to become incredibly influential. We have a surprisingly detailed account of whom Ramesses appointed and how he made his decision. It happened at Abdju in the first year of his reign, and it involved a careful selection process. The story comes to us from the man whom Ramesses appointed. His name, in hieroglyphs, is Nebwenenef. Late in his life, Nebwenenef constructed a tomb in the hills west of Luxor, and in that tomb he recorded his biography, including the day Ramesses appointed him to power. Before his promotion, Nebwenenef was a mid to high-ranking priest in the Abdju area. His early jobs were, quote, the first priest of Anhur, or Anurus, an ancient god of war and hunting. He was also the first priest of Hathor, lady of Eunet, so he was responsible for offerings and business in Dendera, the famous town that now hosts Hathor's magnificent temple. Finally, Nebwenenef was, quote, overseer of all priests, of all gods, as far south as Her Amun, an unknown location, and as far north as Chenni, or Thinis. That mouthful of a title seems to be a kind of human resources job. Nebwenenef was the manager of temple personnel in this part of the country. So he was prominent, and he had a lot of experience managing people. That was going to be helpful. Notably, none of his titles reference the city of Abdju, Abydos, or the great god of Abdju, Usir, Osiris. It seems that the temples of Abdju and Osiris were separate from other local facilities. They had their own priests and administration, and we know the names of many of these officials. It's not clear why there was such a distinction. Maybe Abdju was too important, its temples too large and wealthy to be connected with others. Either way, Nebwenenef was part of a regional administration, but not the temple at Abdju. We don't know where Nebwenenef was when he received the call to power, but on the walls of his tomb he describes the event with great relish and pride. Quote, Year 1, the third month of Akhet, day unknown, of Ramesses II. His person, the king, sailed from the southern city, Waset, having done that which pleased his father, Amun-Ra, and the Ennead of gods that is in Waset. He did this in the beautiful festival of Opet. The king made a landing in the Cheni province, and Nebwenenef was brought in before his person. Then Pharaoh said to Nebwenenef, quote, "You are now the first priest of Amun. His treasury and his granary are under your seal. You are the chief director of his temple, and every foundation or property of his is under your authority." Then the courtiers together acclaimed the goodness of his person, the king, giving praise multiple times in the presence of this good God. End quote. Oh, Nebwenenef was proud. From semi-humble beginnings, he was entering the big leagues. The highest priestly role in the south, communion with Amun-Ra, king of the gods, and the administrative power, management of Karnak and all the agricultural land, the workshops, the villages, and the people attached to that institution. This was no mean feat. It is not an exaggeration to say that Karnak was the southern city, utterly dominating the community of that region. At a stroke, Ramesses had elevated this priest/manager to the highest ranks of Egyptian society. You can understand why he recorded it in such detail. Naturally, the text carries on with abundant praise of the pharaoh for his wisdom and good choice. I won't bore you with the accolades. Suffice to say, Nebwenenef was extremely grateful to his monarch. What's more interesting is how he got the job. Nebwenenef describes the situation confronting Ramesses and how he made his decision for the new priest. It involved a divine oracle. Quote, Ramesses said to Nebwenenef, "Behold, as Ra lives for me, and as my father Amun favors me, I, the king, set out the entire court and the chief commander of the soldiers in front of Amun. The priests and the noble ones of Amun's house entered his presence repeatedly, but Amun was not satisfied with any of them, until I mentioned your name to him." End quote. According to Nebwenenef, Ramesses chose the high priest via oracle. The king presented a range of candidates before Amun-Ra, that is, probably before a statue of the deity, and one by one Amun rejected them all, until Ramesses suggested Nebwenenef, and then Amun was pleased. So the god himself chose the new candidate to be his first priest, the Netjer Tepy. But how did this oracle go ahead? Well, we can possibly reconstruct it. Based on the ancient sources, there were a couple of ways in which a divine oracle could occur. One involved drawing lots, writing down the possible answers on different pieces of paper or shards of pottery, and then putting them into a bag, a jug, or a box. The god, or his priestly representative, reached into that bag and drew a piece out, and whatever was written on that piece was the answer the god wished. Another version of the oracle involved walking. The candidates for a job would stand in a line or a circle. The priests would bring the deity out of its shrine, carried on their shoulders. Then they would walk around the group of candidates, and wherever the god stopped, that person was their choice. Finally, there was the method of the speaking statue. Somebody would bring their question to the god, either saying it out loud or writing down the possible answers on pottery and placing them around the statue. Then the god would speak its answer or move towards the proper choice. That is a brief summary of the options. We'll have many more opportunities to explore this in future, but you get the idea. It sounds like Ramesses used option 2 or 3 in his consultation. Nebwenenef describes the king setting out the candidates, That could mean they gathered physically, or the pharaoh wrote their names on papyrus and placed them before the god. Or he simply spoke each name in turn and waited for Amun's answer. Through one of these mechanisms, the king obtained his choice. Notably, it sounds as though Neb-Wenenef was absent when the oracle itself occurred. He specifically says that Amun was glad when Ramesses spoke Neb-Wenenef's name. This election in absentia might suggest that Ramesses was communing privately with the deity, telling Amun the candidates and receiving answers in turn. Alas, because Neb-Wenenef was absent, the oracle itself is slightly vague. Perhaps he didn't care to check too closely. The answer was good, and he was glad to have it. So, Ramesses made his decision through the oracle of Amun, and reflecting on this, he gave extra special instruction to his new appointee. Following the description of the oracle, Neb-Wenenef adds the following, quote, Ramesses said, "Serve the god well, because he has desired you, Neb-Wenenef. I know that you are efficient. Do even more than that, and then Amun's Ka spirit will favor you, and mine will as well. He, Amun, will cause you to live at the head of his estate, and he will grant you old age within it, and he will bring you to harbor in the soil of his city. That is, he will take care of you when you die." End quote. The god had made his choice, and Ramesses laid a special charge upon Neb-Wenenef. Do his utmost, perform to the best of his ability, and he would be rewarded, not just by the king, but by the deity himself. Neb-Wenenef must have fulfilled this contract to some degree, because he lived long enough to construct a lovely tomb in the hills west of Luxor, and in that tomb he showed himself coming before Ramesses. In one scene, the king stands in his window of appearances, a kind of balcony at a temple or palace, and Ramesses reaches out to almost touch Neb-Wenenef, who is standing below and in front of him. Scenes like these are relatively common, but Neb-Wenenef seems to have reached the end of his life in good favor and good standing. So he must have served Amun-Ra and the administration of Karnak relatively well. Anyway, the king summoned Neb-Wenenef to Abdju, and he gave him the good news of his promotion. Soon after, the priest would set sail upriver, following the breeze up to the southern city. There, he would take up residence, possibly at Karnak itself, and begin his new job. We'll see him again before too long. Ramesses stayed in Abdju long enough to undertake major building projects. He appointed Neb-Wenenef as the First Priest of Amun. He resumed work on his late father's memorial temple, and he claims to have done restoration in the ancient necropolis of the earliest kings. Alongside that, there were oracles to consult, rituals and offerings for the gods, and probably a lot of business, consultations with courtiers and local bigwigs, the 1001 tasks of an absolute monarch. Inevitably, though, it was time to leave. We don't have an exact date for Ramesses' departure from Abdju, but the king had left Waset on day 23 in the 3rd month of Akhet, around October. The next recorded date comes from further north, and it marks the season of Peret, the planting season, roughly December to March. So Ramesses probably departed Abdju in the 4th month of Akhet, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after his arrival. That is an educated guess, but it gives us a rough timeline of his movements, which is fun. We don't often get these week-by-week itineraries. As his royal ship cast off, the weather was beginning to cool. The wind, blowing from the northwest, brought a slight chill to the river valley, and it blew against the Nile current. The rowers of Ramesses' barge would have to ply their oars with great strength to maintain a good speed. But row they did, and Ramesses' vessel set off to the north. For the next 2 to 3 weeks, the royal ship made its way downriver. The king probably stopped at towns and temples along the way, doing the same things he had at Abdju, making offerings in local shrines, receiving blessings from patron deities, meeting priests and local leaders, and arranging the business of his kingdom. Keeping that image in mind, the royal flotilla probably made its way north in a stop-start fashion, a day on the water, a day in a town, repeat and repeat over the next few weeks. One day, Ramesses emerged from his ship's cabin to see a magnificent sight. Pyramids. Lining the west bank of the Nile, to the port of Ramesses' ship, the artificial mountains began to rise along the desert's edge. In 1292 BCE, the Egyptian pyramid age was well and truly done, at least for the kings. But depending on his itinerary, Ramesses might have sailed past a couple dozen of these monuments erected in previous centuries. First, he may have seen the Middle Kingdom pyramids at Lahun and the Fayum, built some 500 years before. Then, sailing further north, Ramesses would have seen sites like Meidum and Dashur, where the fabulous pyramids of Sneferu stood proud and shining. They were more than 1,300 years old at this point in time. Next, the Step Pyramid, constructed for King Netjer Tepy, whom Ramesses would have known as Djeser or Djoser. That monument stood at Saqqara, a legendary necropolis that was still more than active after 1,400 years. Along the way, Ramesses almost certainly visited Men-Nefer, or Memphis, and the sacred precinct of Ptah, which he would have called Hiku-Ptah, or the House of Ptah's Spirit, from which we ultimately derive the word Egypt. Ramesses left many monuments in Memphis, and we will talk about them properly in future. Suffice to say, the pharaoh's journey north certainly included a stop at the ancient residence and the House of Ptah. Perhaps Ramesses came before that god to receive his crowns, just as he had in the south. Again, all of that in another chapter. Finally, Ramesses departed Memphis and headed north once more, and eventually his ship came in sight of Giza, the necropolis of Rosetau, dominated by the vast pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, and the smaller one of Menkaura. In those days, the river Nile came much closer to Giza than it does now, and as his royal barge approached the necropolis, Ramesses could probably sail right up to a special place, the harbour in front of the Sphinx. Ramesses visited the Giza plateau in his first regnal year, and he left several monuments testifying to that journey. First, the king disembarked his great vessel near the valley temple of Khafra. There, Ramesses commissioned a stela honoring the distant ancestor. That stela survives in fragments, and it gives us the date of Ramesses' visit, regnal year 1 in the season of Peret. The month is unknown, but the day is 20. So maybe December or January, roughly speaking. The king also visited the Great Sphinx, and he commissioned monuments in its honor. In front of this statue, Ramesses left another stela. It is broken today, only a tiny portion remains, but it gives a hint of the king's mindset and his priorities when viewing this monument. The stela says, quote, "Regnal year 1 under the person of Ramesses II, the good god, youthful as king, the lord of might and valor, a hero warrior. He treads the land like Montu on the move when he crosses over the heads of the 9 bows, the traditional enemies. Ramesses is swifter than an arrow from the bow when he flies like a divine falcon behind his enemies. He traverses the foreign lands like the going forth of a flame. He is the ferocious lion against the Easterners, sharp of tooth and keen of claws." End quote. Alas, most of the stela is lost, but you get the gist. The text focuses on the pharaoh as a warrior, a lion amongst men, rampaging like Montu, the southern war god. That might sound strange. Modern mythology often associates sphinxes with mystery or riddles, but in the New Kingdom it was quite different. The Egyptian pharaohs liked to portray sphinxes as fighters. You will find these animals on thrones, chariots, and decorative objects, where the lion-human hybrids rampage in battle. They trample foes and wreak bloody slaughter. If you'll allow me to speculate, that martial image may have appealed strongly to young Ramesses. He was a new ruler, powerful, and ready to prove himself on the field of battle. Visiting the Sphinx and reflecting on the strength of that animal, the new king might have found inspiration for his forthcoming adventures. Ramesses did not just glorify himself, though. When he visited this monument, he also made offerings to the image and contributions to the Sphinx's temple. In between the forelegs of the statue, up against its chest, earlier rulers had erected stone stelae in honor of the Sphinx. This area rapidly turned into a sort of makeshift chapel or shrine to the god who inhabited the statue. Ramesses followed that tradition, and he commissioned new masonry in that space, turning this makeshift shrine into something more formal. To either side of the gap between the Sphinx's forelegs, Ramesses added stone walls to make a small enclosure. This was an open-air building so that sunlight could flood into it, and Ramesses decorated the walls of this chapel with images of himself honoring the Sphinx. He holds incense burners, purifying the air, and jars of water or perfume to offer to the deity. The blocks are terribly weathered. Leaving them in the open air will do that, but the picture of the Sphinx is pretty clear. The statue rests atop its pedestal or terrace, carved to look like a palace. It has the long headdress that is still visible today, with a serpent or uraeus at the brow. The Sphinx's beard is long and curved like that of the gods, which is appropriate, because around 1292 BCE, the Great Sphinx itself was a deity. By the time Ramesses visited the Sphinx, it was already 1,300 years old, approximately, and in the recent past, the enormous image had acquired its own identity as a deity. Its name, which appears on Ramesses' monuments, was Hor-em-Akhet, or Horus in the Horizon. You'll sometimes find this name in the Greek version, Hamarkis. Hor-em-Akhet is a lesser-known deity, but he combines the power of Horus, kingship, with the solar imagery of Ra. As the sun flies across the sky from horizon to horizon, you might imagine it as a bird of prey, like the falcon of Horus. And because the Great Sphinx faces eastward to the sunrise, it acquired some of the mystique of the solar god. There's not a lot to say about Hor-em-Akhet. He does not have a particularly detailed mythology, but the god seems to have inhabited the statue of the Great Sphinx, and rulers like Ramesses and his predecessors in the New Kingdom honored the statue as an image of that being. From these monuments and other fragments, we can reconstruct the royal visit. Ramesses came to Giza at the start of his reign, and he honored the Great Sphinx as an incarnation of Hor-em-Akhet, Horus in the Horizon. Based on the surviving part of his stela, he prayed to the statue for strength and victory in war, and in the missing sections, he might have prayed for a long life given by the sun god and the power to rule many years as king. Would any of these wishes come true? Time would tell. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. The show will return in 2 weeks as Ramesses begins to prepare his military undertakings, his adventures to foreign lands. We will also visit the famous city that Ramesses called Pi Ramesses, Great of Victories. That episode is in 2 weeks. In the meantime, I do have an interesting interview. Recently, Professor Aidan Dodson sat down with me to discuss his new book about King Thutmose III and the Queen King Hatshepsut. With that particular period in the public limelight, thanks to the discovery of Thutmose II's tomb, I chatted with Professor Dodson about his new work, and how those two rulers really defined the New Kingdom in a way that Ramesses would have understood. That interview is next week, and in 2 weeks, our narrative resumes once more. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I'd especially like to thank my subscribers on Patreon, who help me to afford things like food and housing so that I can do the research and writing of this show. An extra special thank you must go to the priests, my top-tier subscribers. These fine folks go way beyond the ordinary levels of generosity, and I am forever in their debt. Special thanks to Linda, Niden, Ashley, Eric, Terry, Daniel, Veronica, TJ, James, Yola, Mycost, Jeffrey, Andy and Chelsea, Jean, Karen, Yen, Dan, Chris, James, and Setnacht. Folks, thank you so much for your incredible generosity. May the Great Sphinx himself, Hor-em-Akhet, Horus in the horizon, bring down your enemies and raise you up to the heights of success. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. May the great gods of Giza, Waset, Mennefer, or any pantheon you prefer, bring success and happiness to your life. I'll see you soon.